The first time I found a garden gnome in my yard, I was convinced the stress of my new job had finally pushed me into hallucination territory. It was small, no taller than 6 inches, with a pointy red hat and a mischievous smile that seemed to say, "You have no idea what you're in for, pal." I didn't know then that this tiny ceramic creature would be the first soldier in a war that would consume my life for the next year. My name is Greg Bentley, and I moved to Pinecrest Estates in Marietta, Georgia about 2 years ago. The neighborhood looked perfect, mature oak trees lining clean streets, well-maintained lawns, and houses that all seemed to have that same upper-middle-class charm without looking identical. The real estate agent mentioned there was an HOA, but assured me they were reasonable and just maintained property values. I should have seen the warning signs when she wouldn't look me in the eye while saying this. The first 6 months were peaceful. I renovated my kitchen, planted some native Georgia wildflowers in the backyard, and generally kept to myself. My neighbors seemed pleasant enough, especially Emma Sutton next door, a retired high school English teacher who brought me homemade banana bread when I moved in. Then came the gnomes. It started as a joke. My nephew Tyler visited for a weekend, and we went to this garden center on the outskirts of town. He became obsessed with this display of garden gnomes, dozens of them in different poses and outfits. He begged me to buy one, and I gave in, picking a fisherman gnome with a tiny rod and a bucket hat. When we got home, Tyler placed it under the dogwood tree in my front yard. "He'll protect the house, Uncle Greg," Tyler said solemnly. I laughed it off, but the gnome stayed. I named him Gerald. 2 weeks later, I found myself back at the garden center, purchasing a companion for Gerald, a gnome with gardening shears that I named Harold. Before I knew it, I had a collection of 7 gnomes arranged in a semicircle around the dogwood tree. They made me smile every time I pulled into the driveway after a long day at the engineering firm. The first letter arrived exactly 3 months after Gerald took up residence. It was printed on crisp white paper with the Pinecrest Estates Homeowners Association letterhead. "Dear resident," it read, "it has come to our attention that you have placed unauthorized lawn ornaments on your property. According to Pinecrest Estates HOA Regulation 7.3.2, all exterior decorations must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee prior to installation. Please remove said items within 72 hours or face a daily fine of $50. It was signed, Patricia Kimberly, HOA President. I'd never met Patricia, but I'd heard stories. She was relatively new to the board but had quickly seized control and was wielding her power like a medieval despot. Emma had warned me that Patricia had cited her for having wind chimes that were excessively audible. I decided to be reasonable. I called the number on the letterhead and left a message requesting information about the approval process. 3 days later, another letter arrived, this one with a $150 fine for failure to comply with removal notice. No response to my inquiry about the approval process. That evening, as I was contemplating whether to remove my gnome collection, Emma came over with a fresh loaf of zucchini bread and a sympathetic ear. "Patricia's on another crusade," she said, shaking her head as we sat on my porch. "Last month it was the Johnsons' bird feeder. Before that, it was the Garcia's wind spinner." "But garden gnomes," I asked. "They're classic. Half the houses in America have them." "Not in Patricia's version of America," Emma replied. "She's got this vision of Pinecrest as some kind of pristine showcase neighborhood, no personality allowed." I looked at my little gnome collection. They weren't garish or tasteless. They were charming, damn it. "What happens if I don't pay the fine?" I asked. Emma's eyes widened. "Oh, Greg, don't go there. She'll put a lien on your house. She's done it before. Over garden gnomes." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Over a flamingo mailbox cover," Emma confirmed. "To the Wilsons last year." I reluctantly agreed to move my gnomes to the backyard, out of sight from the street. The next day, I received another letter acknowledging my partial compliance, but noting that any lawn ornaments visible from neighboring properties were still in violation. Apparently, my backyard was visible from the Thompsons' second-floor window, and Patricia had recruited them as her eyes in the sky. It was then that I realized this wasn't about rules or property values. This was about control. And something in me, maybe the part that had spent too many years being reasonable, compromising when I didn't need to, snapped. I wasn't going to remove my gnomes. I was going to fight back. My first step was to read the HOA covenant from cover to cover. It was 47 pages of mind-numbing legalese, but buried on page 23, I found what I was looking for. The rule about lawn ornaments specifically prohibited fixtures that detract from the aesthetic harmony of the community. The examples listed included excessive or garish decorations, inflatable items exceeding 3 feet in height, and ornaments with political, offensive, or commercial messaging. Nowhere did it specifically mention garden gnomes. Armed with this knowledge, I drafted a response to Patricia, citing the exact language of the covenant and requesting specific clarification on how my gnomes violated the aesthetic harmony clause. I sent it via certified mail. A week passed with no response. Then, one evening as I was coming home from work, I saw Patricia herself in my front yard, taking pictures of my gnomes with her phone. She was a tall woman in her 50s, with a blonde bob so perfect it looked like it could withstand a hurricane, wearing crisp khaki pants and a polo shirt with the Pinecrest logo embroidered on it. I pulled into my driveway and approached her. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She jumped slightly, then composed herself. "Mr. Bentley, I'm Patricia Kimberly, president of the Pinecrest Estates HOA." Her voice had that forced pleasantness that barely concealed underlying contempt. "Yes, we've been corresponding," I replied. "I sent you a letter last week requesting clarification on the covenant rules regarding my garden decorations. The rules are clear," she said, gesturing to my gnome collection. "These things are not in keeping with the aesthetic standards of our community." "According to which specific clause?" I pressed. She blinked rapidly. "The Architectural Review Committee has determined I'd like to see the minutes of the meeting where this was determined," I interrupted, "and the specific criteria used to evaluate aesthetic harmony." Patricia's smile tightened. "Mr. Bentley, this isn't a courtroom. The committee has broad discretion to interpret the covenant." "Then I'd like to appeal their interpretation," I countered. "Fine," she snapped. "Submit your appeal in writing. The board meets next month. But in the meantime, these need to go, or the fines will continue to accrue." She turned on her heel and walked away, her stride stiff with anger. That night, I received an unexpected visitor. My doorbell rang around 8 p.m., and I opened it to find a man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes. "Greg Bentley?" he asked, extending his hand. "I'm Howard Chen. I live over on Maple Drive. I heard you're having some trouble with Patricia and the gnomes." I invited Howard in, offered him a beer, which he accepted, and we sat in my living room. "I was on the HOA board before Patricia staged her little coup last year," Howard explained. She's something else. She moved here from a much more exclusive neighborhood in Alpharetta and seems determined to turn Pinecrest into her idea of perfection." "What happened with the board?" I asked. Howard took a long sip of his beer. She got herself elected, then gradually pushed out anyone who disagreed with her. Now it's just her and 3 of her cronies. The meetings are a joke. They're scheduled at odd times when most people can't attend, and the minutes are vague enough to give them cover for almost any decision. That can't be legal, I protested. It's in a gray area, Howard admitted. The covenant gives the board a lot of power, but she's definitely pushing the boundaries. Several of us have been looking for a way to challenge her, but nobody wants to be the one to stick their neck out. I thought about my little gnome army. Well, it looks like I'm already in her crosshairs. Howard leaned forward. That's why I'm here. A group of us homeowners who are fed up with Patricia's reign of terror. We've been meeting. If you're interested, we could use someone with backbone. And just like that, I became the face of the Pinecrest Estates gnome rebellion. The next day, I went to the bank and paid the accumulated fines, $350 so far under protest, keeping detailed records of all transactions. Then, I submitted my formal appeal to the HOA board, citing specific sections of the covenant that I believed protected my right to display garden gnomes. While waiting for the board meeting, I did some research. I found that in the state of Georgia, HOAs did indeed have significant power, but they weren't all powerful. They had to follow their own covenants, and they had to enforce rules consistently. If they allowed one homeowner to do something but penalized another for the same thing, that could be grounds for challenging their decisions. Armed with this knowledge, I started walking the neighborhood, taking discreet photos of lawn ornaments, decorative flags, and other exterior personalizations that seemed comparable to my gnomes. I found several: a house with a ceramic deer family, another with large decorative stones painted to look like ladybugs, and even one with a small fountain featuring cherubs. Howard introduced me to the resistance group, which had been meeting secretly in Rachel Liu's basement. Rachel was a corporate attorney who had moved to Pinecrest a year ago and quickly found herself at odds with Patricia over her decision to install solar panels on her roof. Despite clear state laws protecting homeowners' rights to solar energy, Patricia had made the process as difficult as possible. The group included about 15 homeowners, each with their own Patricia horror story. There was Martin Acaffer, cited for leaving his garbage invisible from the street for 3 hours after collection. Deanna Vasquez, who received daily fines when her daughter's wedding decorations remained up for a week. And Robert Johnson, whose American flag was deemed excessively large despite meeting all state and federal flag display guidelines. The problem, Rachel explained during one meeting, is that while Patricia's interpretations of the covenant are often extreme, they're not technically illegal. The covenant does give the board broad discretion. What we need is to either change the covenant, which requires a 2/3 vote from all homeowners, or change the board. Elections aren't for another 6 months, Martin pointed out. Then we need to make the next 6 months uncomfortable enough for Patricia that she backs down or makes a clear mistake we can leverage, Rachel replied. And that's when I had my idea. If Patricia thought my garden gnomes were bad, I was about to show her what aesthetic disharmony really looked like. The day before my appeal was to be heard by the board, I removed all 7 of my garden gnomes from my yard. I placed them carefully in boxes in my garage, promising Gerald I would bring him back triumphantly someday. Then I went shopping. The HOA covenant was specific about what wasn't allowed, but it couldn't possibly cover everything. I spent hours scouring the document for loopholes, and then I spent an entire Saturday driving to every garden center, hardware store, and flea market within a 50-mile radius of Marietta. Sunday morning, I was up at dawn. Emma watched from her porch, coffee cup in hand, as I worked methodically around my front yard. By noon, my masterpiece was complete, and neighbors were starting to slow down as they drove past, some even stopping to take pictures. Where my 7 innocent gnomes had once stood, I now had a flock of 20 plastic pink flamingos arranged in a perfect circle around my dogwood tree. Not the tasteful, vintage kind, these were the brightest, most garish flamingos I could find, with glitter embedded in the plastic. A 6-foot-tall metal sculpture of a rooster, painted in rainbow colors, positioned proudly by my mailbox. The covenant restricted inflatable decorations over 3 feet, but said nothing about metal sculptures. A collection of spinning pinwheels, 37 of them planted along my front walkway, catching the Georgia breeze and creating a kaleidoscope of color. 3 garden-gazing balls on pedestals, positioned strategically so they reflected the sun directly at Patricia's front windows at different times of the day. And the piece de resistance, a garden bed where I'd arranged stones and drought-resistant plants to spell out "Free the Gnomes" in letters visible from the street. None of these items technically violated the specific prohibitions in the covenant. They weren't political, offensive, or commercial. They weren't inflatable. They were, however, a deliberate assault on Patricia's sense of aesthetic harmony. It didn't take long for the reaction I was expecting. At 2:17 p.m., I noted the time carefully. Patricia's black Lexus SUV screeched to a halt in front of my house. She emerged like a tornado in designer jeans, her face a fascinating shade of purple I'd never seen on a human being before. "What is this?" she screamed, not bothering with her usual facade of politeness. I was waiting on my porch, iced tea in hand. "Good afternoon, Patricia. Lovely day, isn't it? You removed those gnomes just to put up this." She gestured wildly at my yard, which admittedly now looked like a carnival had exploded on it. "I complied with your order to remove the gnomes," I said calmly. "These are different decorative elements that don't violate any specific prohibition in the covenant. I've reviewed it thoroughly." This is," she sputtered. "Aesthetic disharmony," I suggested helpfully. By now, several neighbors had gathered to watch the spectacle. I noticed Howard among them, failing to hide his grin. Emma was openly laughing from her porch. Patricia composed herself with visible effort. "The board meeting is tomorrow, Mr. Bentley. This display will be addressed then, and your fines will be doubled." "On what grounds?" I asked innocently. "Willful disruption of community standards," she snapped. "I don't see that clause in the covenant," I replied. "But I look forward to discussing it at the meeting. I'll bring my copy fully annotated." Patricia stormed back to her car, but not before I caught her taking multiple photos of my yard. That evening, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing with texts and calls from neighbors. Some were concerned I'd lost my mind. Others were offering enthusiastic support, and a few wanted to know where I'd found the rainbow rooster. The Pinecrest community Facebook page, which was usually a dull collection of lost pet announcements and recommendations for plumbers, exploded with photos of my yard and heated debates about HOA overreach. The next evening, the HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. in the community clubhouse. Typically, these meetings were attended by the board members and maybe 3 or 4 other homeowners. When I arrived at 6:45, the parking lot was full, and people were standing in the doorway trying to get in. Rachel, the attorney, spotted me and pulled me inside. "This is unprecedented," she whispered. "There must be 100 people here." The small room was packed, with people leaning against walls and sitting on tables. Patricia and the other 3 board members sat at a folding table at the front, looking stunned by the turnout. "We may need to reschedule to find a larger venue," suggested Brenda Miller, the board secretary. a timid woman who usually just took notes and agreed with Patricia. "We will proceed as planned," Patricia declared, her voice tight. "Let's call this meeting to order." The board went through some standard business: first, approval of previous minutes, treasurer's report, while the crowd grew increasingly restless. Finally, they reached new business, and Patricia cleared her throat. "We have an appeal from Mr. Greg Bentley regarding citation 2023-147 for unauthorized lawn ornaments. Mr. Bentley, you have 5 minutes to present your case." I stood up, holding my annotated copy of the covenant. "Thank you, Madam President. I'm appealing the citation for my garden gnomes on several grounds. First, the covenant doesn't specifically prohibit garden gnomes. Second, the enforcement of the aesthetic harmony clause has been inconsistent, as evidenced by several other properties in the neighborhood with similar decorative elements. I presented my photos of other lawn ornaments in the neighborhood, projected from my tablet onto the wall. There were audible murmurs as people recognized their own homes. Third, I continued, the process for determining what constitutes aesthetic disharmony is subjective and lacks transparent criteria. And finally, the timing and manner of the fines violated the covenant's own procedures for notification and appeal. Patricia interrupted. "Mr. Bentley, your 5 minutes are up. The board will now point of order," called Rachel, standing up. "According to Robert's rules, which your own bylaws state govern these meetings, an appellant should be allowed to finish their presentation without interruption." Patricia looked like she wanted to argue but nodded stiffly. "Proceed." "In conclusion," I said, "I believe the citation should be rescinded, the fines refunded, and clear, objective criteria established for what constitutes acceptable lawn decorations in Pinecrest Estates." I sat down to scattered applause. Patricia looked around the room, then leaned in to confer with the other board members. After a moment, she straightened up. "The board has considered your appeal and decided to uphold the citation. The gnomes violate the aesthetic harmony clause, and the board's interpretation of that clause is final according to Article 4 of the covenant." Before I could respond, Howard stood up. "I'd like to make a motion from the floor." Patricia frowned. "That's not, it is allowed," Howard insisted. Article 7, Section 2 of the covenant states that any homeowner in good standing may make a motion at a general meeting. Patricia looked to Brenda, who nervously flipped through her copy of the covenant and nodded confirmation. "Fine," Patricia said. "State your motion." "I move that we hold a special election for the HOA board to be conducted within 30 days, Howard announced. The room erupted in cheers and shouts of "second." Patricia banged a gavel I hadn't noticed before. "Order! This is out of order." Rachel stood again. "Actually, it's not. The covenant allows for special elections if called for by a 2/3 vote of homeowners present at a general meeting. I count 112 homeowners here tonight, out of 243 total in Pinecrest. If 75 vote in favor of the motion, it passes." Patricia's face went from red to white. This is a coup. It's democracy," Rachel corrected. "Shall we vote?" The vote was 98 in favor, 7 against, with the board abstaining. Patricia sat in stunned silence as Howard outlined the procedure for the special election, which would be overseen by a neutral third party, a local judge who happened to be Martin's brother-in-law. As the meeting broke up, people gathered around me, some congratulating me on my stand against the HOA, others asking if I was really going to keep the flamingo army and rainbow rooster in my yard. "That depends," I told them, "on whether the new board will let me have my gnomes back." The next month was a flurry of campaigning. Patricia and her allies fought hard to retain control, sending out glossy mailers about maintaining property values and community standards. Our rebel alliance countered with town halls in people's living rooms, where homeowners shared their HOA horror stories, and we outlined a vision for a more collaborative approach. The special election was held on a Saturday in the community clubhouse. Turnout was record-breaking. 217 out of 243 homeowners cast votes. The tension as the ballots were counted was palpable. In the end, it wasn't even close. Howard was elected president with 68% of the vote. Rachel became vice president, Martin was the new treasurer, and Deanna took over as secretary. Patricia and her entire slate were ousted. In his first act as president, Howard ceremoniously presented me with a certificate rescinding the citation for my garden gnomes. The crowd that had gathered for the election results cheered as I promised to remove the flamingos and restore Gerald and his friends to their rightful place. "What about the rooster?" someone called out. I laughed. "He's growing on me." Maybe I'll keep him as a reminder not to take ourselves too seriously. Over the next 6 months, the new board worked with homeowners to revise the covenant. We kept the basic structural protections that prevented truly problematic issues like abandoned vehicles or dangerous conditions, but relaxed the more subjective aesthetic rules. Garden decorations were explicitly allowed, within reasonable limits, as were holiday displays, native plant gardens, and other personal touches that made a house a home. Patricia put her house on the market 3 weeks after the election. I heard through the grapevine that she was moving to a gated community with an even stricter HOA. I sent her a farewell card with a picture of Gerald the gnome giving a cheerful wave. A year after the gnome rebellion began, Pinecrest Estates held a community picnic in the park at the center of the neighborhood. Tables were laden with potluck dishes, kids played on the playground, and neighbors who had previously only nodded politely to each other were now engaged in animated conversations. Emma joined me on a bench, handing me a plate of her famous deviled eggs. "You know, I've lived here 15 years, and this is the first time I've known most of my neighbors' names." I looked around at the gathering. Howard was flipping burgers on the grill. Rachel was organizing a game of volleyball. The Garcia's wind spinner twirled merrily in the breeze. "It's not just about gnomes, is it?" I mused. "It never was," Emma agreed. "It was about feeling at home in your own home." As if on cue, a small boy ran up to me, holding something behind his back. It was Tyler, my nephew, who was visiting again for the weekend. "Uncle Greg, I got you something," he announced proudly, revealing a new garden gnome, this one wearing sunglasses and holding a miniature "Free the Gnomes" sign. I laughed and accepted the gift. "He's perfect. What should we name him?" Tyler thought for a moment, his face serious. "Liberty," he decided. "Because he fought for freedom." "Liberty it is," I agreed. That evening, I added Liberty to the semicircle under my dogwood tree, where Gerald, Harold, and the others had been restored to their rightful place. The rainbow rooster still stood by my mailbox now, with official HOA approval, a colorful reminder that sometimes, to fix something broken, you have to be willing to make things a little worse first. As I stood admiring my eclectic lawn display, Howard walked by with his dog. He stopped to chat, gesturing at the gnomes. "You know, some people might say this all started over something silly," he remarked. I shook my head. "It wasn't silly. It was about someone trying to control others just because they could. That's never silly." Howard nodded thoughtfully. "The new covenant goes to vote next week. I think it'll pass easily." "And if it doesn't?" I asked. Howard grinned and glanced at my garage. "I heard you still have those flamingos in there." I laughed. "Emergency backup plan." After Howard continued his walk, I sat on my porch steps and looked out at my little patch of Pinecrest Estates. The sun was setting, casting long shadows from the dogwood tree across my lawn. My gnomes seemed to smile a little wider in the golden light. The funny thing was, I'd never been one for lawn ornaments before all this happened. I'd always been the quiet guy who kept to himself, who avoided conflict and followed rules. But something about Patricia's arbitrary enforcement, the pettiness of it all, had awakened something in me. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. Covenant revision draft is final. Check your email for review before the vote. I gave her a thumbs-up emoji in response and made a mental note to read through it carefully that night. The new document wasn't perfect, no governing document ever is, but it was fair, clear, and created with actual input from the people it would govern. Tyler came out onto the porch and sat beside me. "Do you think the gnomes are happy now?" he asked. I put my arm around his shoulders. "I think they're very happy. They can stand proud in the sunshine instead of hiding in a box in the garage. Like people should be able to," Tyler said with the simple wisdom of a child. "Exactly like that," I agreed. As darkness fell, I took one last look at my gnome army before heading inside. Liberty, with his sunglasses and protest sign, seemed to wink at me in the porch light. Some battles are worth fighting, even the ones that seem small. Sometimes, especially those. 6 months after the new covenant was approved by a vote of 219 to 14, I was elected to the HOA board myself. My campaign promise was simple: common sense, common courtesy, common ground. My first official act was to propose a community garden in the unused space behind the clubhouse. The motion passed unanimously. We planted vegetables, herbs, and flowers, with each family in Pinecrest assigned a plot if they wanted one. And at the entrance to the garden, we placed a ceramic gnome, a gift from the community, to commemorate what everyone now called the Great Gnome Rebellion. Patricia never returned to Pinecrest, but I heard from a realtor friend that she joined the board of her new HOA within 3 months of moving in. Some people never learn, but we did, and our neighborhood was stronger for it. As for me, I discovered I had a knack for community organizing. What started as a stand against garden gnome discrimination turned into regular involvement in local politics. 2 years after the gnome incident, I ran for a seat on the Marietta City Council, campaigning on transparency and citizen involvement in governance. I won by a comfortable margin. My first council meeting, I spotted a few familiar faces in the audience: Howard, Rachel, Emma, and several other Pinecrest neighbors. And pinned to my lapel was a tiny gnome pin, a reminder of where it all began. Sometimes people ask if I regret escalating the situation with the flamingos and the rooster. I always tell them the same thing. When reasonable discourse fails, sometimes you need to hold up a mirror to absurdity. My flamingo army wasn't just petty revenge, it was a visible demonstration of how arbitrary and capricious the rules had become. The rainbow rooster still stands by my mailbox, though he's been joined by other tasteful decorations over the years. Every Halloween, I dress him up in a costume. Last year he was a pirate, complete with eye patch and tiny parrot on his shoulder. Children in the neighborhood look forward to seeing what he'll be each year. And my gnome collection, it's grown to 15 now, each with its own name and personality. Gerald is still the patriarch, his fishing rod eternally poised to catch a ceramic fish that's never coming. Liberty stands proudly with his protest sign, a reminder of battles won and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when others think it's trivial. Emma and I started dating a year after the Gnome Rebellion. It turned out we had more in common than just a distaste for overbearing HOA presidents. We got married in my backyard, under the dogwood tree, with my gnome collection serving as unorthodox witnesses. Howard officiated, and the entire neighborhood came to celebrate. For our wedding, Tyler, who was our ring bearer, surprised us with a pair of bride and groom gnomes. They now have a place of honor on our mantle, a whimsical reminder of how something as simple as a garden decoration changed the course of our lives. In the end, it wasn't really about the gnomes at all. It was about community, about the right to express yourself in your own space, and about standing up to those who would impose their vision on others simply because they can. Sometimes the smallest battles represent the largest principles. And if there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that you should choose your battles carefully, but once chosen, fight them with everything you've got, even if that means an army of pink flamingos and a rainbow rooster. As I sit on my porch now, watching the sun set over Pinecrest Estates, I can see neighbors chatting across driveways, kids playing freely on lawns, and yes, the occasional garden gnome standing proudly under a tree. Our community isn't perfect, no place is, but it's ours, shaped by the people who live here rather than dictated by those who simply want control. Gerald watches over it all from his spot under the dogwood, his painted-on smile seeming a little more genuine these days. And if you look closely in the right light, you might even catch him winking,